Over the course of the term, you'll be asked to write two short, 2 to 3 page literary analysis. The first over any poem, short story, or drama on the reading calendar up to the midterm. The second 2 to 3 page analysis on any poem, short story, or drama between the midterm and the final. Analyzing literature allows us to contextualize the story and the point the author is trying to make, thinking about the political moment in which it was written, because this actually reveals to us how people of that period were responding to historical events. So as we analyze literature, we're taking part in that recovery of history, but we're also learning how other peoples have dealt with conflict, both in relationships and as entities. And then we can think about how we can learn the lessons of the past to apply them to the future. So if you think back to the beginning of your English 1020 class, you'll remember we began with the rhetorical analysis, and we learned that analysis merely means evaluation by criteria. So when we're writing a literary analysis, we are analyzing a piece of literature, evaluating that piece of literature using criteria. The criteria that we're going to be using for this class is formalism, but we'll be following the writing process that you've learned throughout your entire educational career. So we have to begin by understanding the rhetorical situation. What is it that we're being asked to do? We're being asked to analyze a piece of literature, presuming that our audience is familiar with that piece of literature. And so we have to read carefully, reread the text until we develop a thesis, a thematic thesis, in which we make a claim and then support that claim for a reason, with a reason. We then have to provide evidence that proves our thesis. We do this again using the constraints or components of formalism to argue our point. We then draft. We might utilize the CWC, and yes, they do online tutoring. We might confer with Professor Powers in office hours. We might also utilize our friends or peers we know have stronger writing skills to help us revise, and then we copy edit finally. I like to remind students that we generally find our final thesis in the conclusion of our first draft. When we sit down to draft out our ideas, we often start with probably a claim, but not always a reason. And so this is why revision is absolutely necessary. So we'll be using MLA, and I do expect a works cited entry as well as correct parenthetical citation throughout your essay. Remember that an effective title will allude to your argument or your thesis. Your introduction will introduce the subject to the audience by connecting to their experience. And what I mean by this is we often think that we begin with the piece of literature. However, it is much more effective to use pathos to identify the subject within the piece of literature that we are trying to discuss. So if we're utilizing the monster and our topic of evaluation is identity, we want to think about who our audience is, University of Memphis students, and we want to connect with their experience with identity. So we might begin an essay with, as college students, many of us are struggling to personalize our identity as we leave the relationships that bound us through high school and through our family. So note I'm starting with that subject, introducing it to my audience in an attempt to engage them to want to read my essay. I will then say, Toby Lit, in looking at the identity of a monster, reminds us, and then I can move toward my thesis. Now, of course, I'll want to flesh that out. That would be too short for an introduction, but that's what I'm trying to accomplish. Engagement with my audience, connecting them to the idea that I'm trying to convince them of so that they will read my essay. Of course, the introduction ends with our thesis, which is again where we make our argumentative claim. What does Toby Litz say about identity, and what is the reason for that statement? In the body of the essay, we will prove our thesis using the facts of the text. So this is where we look at those components of formalism, and we discuss how those components utilized within the text argue our point. So we might talk about the genre or the title. We might discuss the setting. We will probably discuss the characters. We may address the figurative language. We will definitely summarize certain points within the plot, again, all in an attempt to arrive at proof of our thematic claim. Students need to recognize as writers that each paragraph within an essay acts kind of as a mini essay in and of itself. So the first sentence of the paragraph should be your assertion of proof. Toby Litz argues the monster's identity is X by doing Z, right? Okay, so then this is where we quote, paraphrase, or summarize portions of the text in order to then approve our assertion. And so a paragraph should have a topic sentence that builds upon our thesis and then should give an illustration, which we then explain how it proves our point. Student writers are often taught that the conclusion of an essay summarizes everything that they've said previously. And this is in fact true, but that's only half of what a good conclusion should do. An effective conclusion also then, like the introduction, should return to the audience to tell us what to do with the information that you've just imparted on us. So analysis is supposed to benefit us. If we learn something by reading Toby Litz's short story, The Monster, and thinking about identity, how can we utilize that new knowledge in our own life to be happier, healthier, more knowledgeable, more successful? So we might think about what is it that the monster teaches us by not going on its journey that we need to utilize in our own journey. And so again, a conclusion does two things. It summarizes or reiterates our argument because now you've definitely proven it, but then again, you tell us, the audience, what to do with this new information. So again, we use the components of formalism as the criteria by which we evaluate a piece of literature. However, we don't necessarily talk about every component. We're only going to focus on the components that actually work to prove the thesis that we are making about the piece of literature under evaluation. And so if I talk about The Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, and I'm thinking thematically about religion, I will definitely talk about the title because that title elicits a question. Is this in fact a very old man with enormous wings, or is this an angel? However, in the same story, I wouldn't really talk about the setting as much. The setting doesn't seem to add to any thematic claim that I would make unless I were taking a post-colonial critical approach to The Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. I'm definitely going to have to consider the foil pairings of the characters. So I might want to talk about the priest and the old neighbor woman and how they represent kind of received knowledge, both cultural and religious. I want to talk about the foil pairing of the very old man with enormous wings and the spider woman as they represent supernatural and how we understand that. And I'm certainly going to want to talk about the community and the child as they interact with our supernatural characters. Again, point of view may or may not be important depending on the argument I'm making, as well as the tone. However, I definitely want to talk about images and symbols. So we might think about the symbol of the spider, as a spider is often seen as deceptive, spinning a web of lies in which to ensnare us. So we might want to think about the poem, "Come into my parlor," said the spider to the fly. So we're being trapped by deception. Whereas wings, and the symbol of wings, has been used to represent freedom, and angels themselves have been seen as symbols of messengers. They're messengers sending us messages. So I would definitely want to talk about the idea of images and symbols in talking about the very old man with enormous wings. And I'm definitely going to have to summarize some plot points in order to make my point. But we need to recognize, again, when writing literary analysis, we presume that our audience is familiar with the text and there is no need to summarize the entirety of the story. And of course, the theme is always going to be my argumentative thesis. I'm going to make a claim about the theme in the text and give a reason for that theme. So again, we want to utilize those components of formalism that argue to our thesis, and we let the others fall away. I'm reiterating this several times because students often will turn in what we call a summary rather than an analysis. So again, do not summarize the entirety of the text which you are analyzing. Presume the audience has read the text, and it's your job to argue the understanding of the text, how we should thematically read the text. And so you may have to summarize the scene in which the Spider Woman tells her audience about how she became a Spider Woman. However, you don't have to tell us in the very beginning of the story, there was a very old man who fell out of the sky and was lying in the mud. You don't have to walk us through the entirety. Remember that your body paragraphs are going to present pieces of the evidence that prove your thesis. So you will start by making a statement or assertion about your evidence. You will then elaborate on that statement with proof from the text and your example or illustration and evaluation. So you might give us, again, a quote, a paraphrase, or a summary. And remember, no matter which of the three you give us, you will also need to give us parenthetical citation. So parenthetical citation should be used whenever you give outside information that is not coming from your own thinking. So take a moment and pause the video and read the following passage, which did actually come out of a student essay. And note how this paragraph presumes the audience has read the story and is familiar and is just explaining to us how we understand that the narrator of The Telltale Heart is in fact unreliable and crazy. One further caution about using quotes, in such a short paper, a 2 to 3 page paper, we do not expect any block quotes. A block quote is anything that is 4 or more lines within your own text. Even if you're analyzing a poem, you will want to break the lines up and evaluate as you go. So we don't generally want to see a block of text. What we do want you to do is blend quotes into your analysis using what we call signal phrases. So don't just dump a quote in the middle of your sentences. You want to attach it to your analysis. As in the example, Brooks believes that men are, quote, programmed to crave validation of their masculinity, and they frequently view women's bodies as a medium for that validation, unquote, and note the parenthetical citation, which is just the page number. Now, because we're only analyzing one text, we don't need to put the author's name within the parenthetical citation. Once we introduce the text and we say the author's full name, we will refer to the author throughout the text by his or her last name only, and when we quote, we only need to give the page number because we know we're only talking about the single text. Just a couple of further cautions or tips of the trade. When we refer to texts and the characters within text, we generally utilize present tense. And the reason for this is because the text exists in all historic moments. Once it's written, it continues to exist. So as in our example, we say, in Faulkner's barn burning, Sertorius warns Despain that Abner is retaliating. Barn, he cried, barn. Note that I'm using past tense within the quote, but I'm using present tense in my evaluation, and this is absolutely correct. The other caution I would want to remind you of is to use the third person narration for authority. So remove any I comments. I think Toby lit. No, just say Toby lit X. This sounds much more authoritative. If we want to talk about the audience, don't use the word you, instead use the word we. This is much more effective in creating or collapsing the distance between the author and the audience. We don't say you need to, you say we need to. And this way, the audience is much more open to your suggestion because you're including yourself within that direction. Finally, remember that by analyzing literature, we're really taking part in culture. We're not just fulfilling an assignment in writing, but we're really thinking about the wisdom of the generations that have come before us and thinking about what it means to be human and how to live successfully. And so the lessons that we can take from literature or the stories remind us of lessons that will actually benefit us if we put them to use in our own lives. Remember that you can, again, utilize the resources of the CWC and my office hours. So often, if you get stuck or you have questions and we can't handle that via email, we can often arrange to have a phone call and hammer anything out for you. So good luck. Let me know if you have any questions.